And they put 200 pounds of furs in a bale, and they'd sew it into a sailcloth canvas bag. Every man had to be able to carry one of those 200-pound bags. So it had to be pretty tough.
Dave McLaren grew up with stories of the fur trade. His family has been living along the shores of Lake Temiskaming since the 1830s. In those days, the Big Lake was a main travel route for the Hudson's Bay Company. Fur traders had been on the lake since the 1600s. They carried furs from various trading posts up to the port at Moose Factory. Water was the one link in a land that was isolated, harsh, and unforgiving. And the waterways were ruled by the mighty Hudson's Bay Company.
Well, at one time they were the supreme power. They, you might say, almost had been like life and death, you know. But it was a very harsh life. The wages was for a top man in the Hudson Bay Company was $16 a month, and a bag of flour cost $16. They were allowed 2 a year.
Lake Temiskaming has always been a dangerous lake. The lower narrows, with steep sides and wind tunnel conditions, have always been unpredictable. Further up, the lake widens into a beautiful but often deadly panorama of big waves and treacherous winds. But dangerous or not, large convoys of canoes took to the waters with furs bound for the European market.
Well, my grandfather, then he worked for Hudson Bay Company for 37 years. He used to be in charge of the Flotilla, I guess you'd call it, of Indian canoes that took trade furs up to Moose Factory to be shipped to England. And there'd be anywhere from 15 to 20 canoes, 36-foot rubbish saw canoes, birch bark canoes.
By the late 1800s, the fur trade was dying and the power of the Hudson's Bay Company was slipping away. White pine loggers were now taking over the waterways. The crews of square timbermen followed the path of the great white pine forests up from the Ottawa Valley onto the shores of Lake Temiskaming.
Now the square timbermen come up here in 6 oar pointers, and they brought a year's supply of food. You signed on for a year. They couldn't fire a man because if they let him go up here, he'd either starve to death, freeze to death, or get lost in the bush, but he'd never make it out to civilization. So what they did, they got the foreman had to be able to beat any man in his gang in a fight, and if anybody had to be disciplined, it was either with a cuff in the ear or a kick in the seat of the pants.
Bunkhouse life was brutal. Some men went crazy from the isolation. Others counted the days until they could head down south with a year's pay burning through their pockets. But the trip out was perhaps the most dangerous of all. At the end of the winter season, the timbers were chained together to form a massive raft, often the size of a football field. The entire crew then climbed on board and floated the timbers along the rivers, over the rapids, all the way to Quebec City. Each raft was big enough to carry 50 men and a cookhouse. Dave McLaren's father signed on with the second-last raft to leave Lake Temiskaming. The logs that made up that run were the last of the great northern white pine.
That was the cream of the white pine. They'd only, on a 60-foot timber, they'd allow one knot on one side. The other ones, they didn't allow any. Now, it was a very wasteful thing.
By the turn of this century, the best of the white pine forests were gone. And when the square timbermen left, the logging mills took their place. Ottawa Valley lumber barons competed with numerous local sawmills for pulp logs and building timbers. At the end of the winter cutting season, logs were floated out onto Lake Temiskaming and pushed down the lake by towboats.
There was 50,000 logs went into each boom. They had 3 booms for a tow, and each boat, Lady Minton and the Alexandra, made 2 trips a week. they run night and day. And they started in April and they finished in October, with the result that they were taking 150,000 logs at a tow down Lake Temiskaming. At the end of the year, they run roughly 15 million logs a year. In this process, they lost about maybe 4 or 5 million logs. Like in bad weather, some of them would go under the boom, some of them would jump over the boom in a storm.
For a boy growing up along the shores of the lake, there wasn't the luxury of a higher education. Once he was big enough, Dave joined his father and brother in the bush, and the young teen soon learned he had to carry his own weight.
Well, we'd put out 1,800 cords. Now, I just told you 100 cords of 4-foot wood was 800 feet long. And we got 25 cents a cord to get that. You load it on the sleigh, then one fella threw it into the car and the other fella piled it. So you handled that wood 3 times in the one day.
Over his lifetime, Dave McLaren has seen the bush workers go the way of the square timbermen and the fur traders. Industrial feller bunchers, skidders, and hauling trucks have replaced the lumberjacks, horses, and water-driven log runs. Today, the waterways are the domain of summer boaters and winter snowmobile buffs, the new land barons in an age of leisure. As for Dave McLaren, he says he has no regrets about coming of age when he had to have a strong back and an iron will to survive.
It was a good life. I was young and I was a little stronger than the average guy, you know. And I felt good about it. In other words, a fellow was poor, but he didn't realize it because everybody else was poor around him. You know what I mean?